Where's your wine?
I've finished.
I should. Should I bring another glass of wine? Are you happy with me too? I will. I think we can start. First of all, I have to welcome Helen Notso, who is sitting next to me, who we're going to be hearing lots from this evening. But before we start, a big thank you to the Václav Havel Library for hosting this event this evening, and particularly to Veronika Brázdilová, who's at the back there, modestly standing, but she's done a great deal to make this happen. And also, as I've just found out, we've got the Canadian Embassy represented here in the form of their press spokesman, Mikhail Vlček. Thank you very much for coming, and thank you all for coming along. Let's lose no time at all. Helen is a remarkable person. She's a Czech and a Canadian. She has so far had an amazingly adventurous life, full of adventure, passion, love, disappointment, drama, just about everything. And that's also why Helen's autobiography, Long Journey Home, A Prague Love Story, is such a gripping read. I mean that in all sincerity. Some memoirs get bogged down in details. There are very few, or there are no, how would I put it, biographical minutiae to slow us down in this book. It is an adventure. It is a passionate adventure. It is a love story. It reads like a novel, because your life so far has been like a novel, or too good to be true. Amazing. And also, I mean, the extraordinary thing about Helen's life is that she's always crossed borders. And I mean that not only in the metaphorical sense of being somebody who's been willing to go to the other side and to look back at her own life from outside, which very few of us, I think, have that ability, but also in a very literal way. Your life has been one where borders and closed borders have played a very central role, and where you have, in the most extraordinary ways, defied these borders. But I'm not going to talk too long, because we're going to hear lots of extracts from this remarkable book. We're going to hear you talking about your life. And I'd like really to start, before we hear the first extract, with by asking you, Helen, about the beginnings of your life here in Prague.
I'd be happy to. Thank you, David. And thank you for turning this into a conversation rather than a presentation of mine, because I think that makes it much more interesting. So thank you. I was born in Prague in 1944 to a very well-to-do family. My father was the director of one of the major banks in Prague, and so in 1948, when I was 4 and the communist coup occurred, it was absolutely necessary that we escape, because the borders were sealed and the persecutions of the middle class, intellectuals, business people began. And so my father, who worked for Česká exportní banka, was asked to testify at the Nuremberg trials against the Nazis, and so he received, through the Americans, an exit visa. So he went to Nuremberg and arranged for a guide and help for my brother, who was 5, and myself, 4, to escape. So the first piece that I would like to read you is that really starts the book, is The Escape. So, shall I do that?
And we're here, you're sort of your mother has, we're at the stage here where your mother has just realized that you're going to be having to escape.
Yes. My mother always cried telling the next part of the story, my father convincing her they had to go, and soon. No goodbyes, despite knowing they might never return, leaving everyone and everything behind. It's over, my father said. Life will never be like this again. How can you think this of me, she cried, crossing the border by myself with 2 small children. We could be shot. We have to risk it, he said, promising to make all the arrangements before he went. A guide, a car and driver waiting on the other side. He left for Nuremberg. One morning soon after, my grandparents hurried through the door of our apartment. Our nanny, Giselle, brought Peter and me into the living room. We were excited, having been told we were going on a train trip with our beloved Babi and Yeda. My mother took Giselle's hands in her own, praying nothing would happen to her, and made her promise to not say a word, no matter what happened. Giselle swore on her life she'd known nothing, an outing. We found a compartment to ourselves. Peter and I watched the countryside race by and begged for treats at village stations. Finally, the train stopped, the end of the line. We climbed down and stood on the platform amidst the belching steam, the soot, the smell of coal. We were in a town several kilometers from the German border. The same train would make its way back to Prague momentarily. Our goodbyes had to be quick. Our grandparents held us tight and kissed us again and again. My mother clung to them, unwilling to let them go. A whistle blew. With many a backward glance, Babi and Yeda climbed up the steps and into the train. Another whistle and the train began to move. We stood waving until it disappeared into the tunnel. A man sidled past and signaled my mother to follow. Keeping a careful distance, she took our hands and led us out to the street. After several blocks, the man stopped. He looked around, opened the rear door of a car parked by the curb, and nodded. We ran and tumbled in. One last quick look, and he jumped into the driver's seat. We drove through the town and into the countryside. Much later, the car slowed and swerved onto a track that led through deep woods. It ended abruptly, and we stopped. We got out and followed the driver into the forest, the pine needles spongy and fragrant under our feet. Except for the chirping of birds, all was silent. My mother told how I suddenly pulled my hand free and ran forward crying, "Maminko, podívejse, houby! Mommy, look, mushrooms." She caught me, clapping a hand over my mouth. At last the man stopped. "This is as far as I go." Horrified, my mother begged, "Please, no, you can't leave us here." He was adamant. He gave her instructions, wished us luck, and disappeared back into the woods. She fell on her knees and buried her face in her hands. Whimpering, Peter and I patted her hair, her shoulders. Finally, she took a deep breath and knelt in front of us. We had to be very brave, she told us. She would take care of us, but we mustn't talk and we mustn't cry. We had to be as quiet as little mice. She got up and took our hands. On and on we walked, stopping to rest every now and then. Suddenly ahead of us, between the trees, a high chain-link fence appeared, its top strung with coils of razor wire. We kept it to our right, as the guide had instructed, and crept forward until we spied a low hut and a wooden watchtower, and between them a laneway blocked by a double set of barriers. We crouched, hidden by the thick trees. "Come," my mother whispered, and taking a firm hold of our hands, she pulled us closer and closer, darting from tree to tree. There were no windows on our side of the hut, and no one was in sight. Suddenly a voice broke the silence. A door slammed, and boot heels crunched on the gravel. A man in a green uniform with a gun slung over his shoulder crossed the laneway and climbed the ladder up the watchtower. We waited, hardly breathing. My mother closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and prayed. Several minutes later, the man came down and went back into the hut. We heard laughter. "Now," my mother said.
And that's, if you want to know what happened next, you have to buy the book. Well, one thing we do know is that you got to Canada. Just listening to that, it's so vivid. How much of it is your own memory? You're a 4-year-old, and how much is it just the memories that have accumulated in your family over the years?
Most of it. I don't know whether it's because that was such a traumatic incident that it blocked memories of my own, or whether it was that there were so many stories about that period of time and that event that I remember it most as the stories my mother told, the story my mother told. And she told it often enough, as she did other stories later, that it became like memories of my own, as vivid as that. And I find it interesting, even as I read it to you. You'd think if I wrote it, experienced it, have read it many times, it would stop getting to me so much, but it still does. I can't read it without a little bit of choking at the memory myself. So.
And to move on to Canada, your family established itself remarkably quickly. Your father was obviously an extremely enterprising man. He became a successful businessman really within a very few years. But there is a shadow over your childhood which you depict very vividly in the book, which is your mother's unhappiness, the fact that she was desperately homesick in this, what she perceived as a really rather boring, middle-class Canadian existence compared with the life that she'd had in Prague.
Yes, very much so. My father did well because he was a banker, and he actually applied as a farmer because that's what Canada was looking for at the time. But once he got there, it was business that he got into and did very well. So he was very busy starting all over again. And we didn't have the difficulties that some immigrants have of starting all over again financially. Being a banker, he had known what to do to take money out of the country. But my mother had a very hard time because she missed her family. She was very close to her parents, and she never did see her mother again. So she was heartbroken. And she had actually, as I say in the book, she had said to her mother, "I don't want to go." And it was her mother who said, "Well, your place is with your husband and children now." And he had to go. So, but yes, she longed for home, and she never stopped talking and referring to Prague as home. She filled my imagination with her stories about Prague and Czechoslovakia and life back home. And I too, because she became depressed, and with her depression and my father busy starting a new life, starting several new companies, I was very lonely. And so I developed this image of paradise lost. That is what Prague meant to me and Czechoslovakia meant to me. And so I longed for it just as she did, and vowed as I was growing up to go back at some point when I could. And the irony of it is that we did very well. My father did well. I went to school, I went to university, I went to private school. We had a cottage.
Did you speak Czech at home?
My parents spoke Czech to us, but as soon as we started school, which was when we first got there, because I was 5 by then, we spoke English to my parents, and this odd thing that I think happens quite a lot, where my mother spoke Czech to us and we spoke English to her, and that's basically how she learned English.
And this story is so full of exciting episodes, and there's so much to tell that I think we can skip through the next few years. You went to university. This was the swinging 60s. You traveled to Europe. You decided to buy a Lambretta moped in London, and spontaneously headed off on this moped, on this Lambretta, around Europe.
Yes.
Which in itself is quite an adventurous thing to do on your own. And this was really how you rediscovered or reconnected with the Czech part of your family, wasn't it?
Yes. Yes. After university, I said, well, this is the opportunity for me to go back, to finally go back to Europe. But I had to find a job, so it was only for the summer, for several weeks in the summer. So, yes, I started in London, bought a Lambretta scooter, and drove through Europe down to Paris and Marseille, and then into Italy and Rome and across to the Adriatic, and finally through Austria to the Czechoslovak border. And the shock to me was just incredible.
Was this a spontaneous decision?
To go?
To go to Czechoslovakia?
No, that was the purpose. When I said I wanted to go to Europe, what I meant was I'll see some of Europe, but I really want to get to Prague. So I was shocked at the contrast between beautiful, neat, flower-filled Austria and then the Czech border. But I made it to Prague, and I found my relatives, which was, I think it's depicted in a very moving way. Grandparents, my grandfather, uncle, and anyway, so what it did for me was at the very difficult farewells, I promised that I'd be back as soon as I could manage it. So.
And you did come back. You didn't come back straight away, but you came back at really a time which we associate more with people leaving Czechoslovakia. You came back 3 or 4 years after the Soviet invasion, at the time of deepest normalization, yes, as it was euphemistically called. But you returned, and not only did you return initially on a tourist visa, but you showed this extraordinary initiative in actually managing to get a trvalý pobyt, a long-term residence permit.
Yes.
Tell us more.
Well, yes, when I had been there that first time, it was 1967, so that was just as Dubček was taking over, and there was hope rising. So when I talked to my aunt and uncle and relatives, they said things could be better because of Dubček and Prague Spring. And then, of course, was the invasion in 1968, which I watched on television from Canada, and my thought was, so my country is being stolen from me again. So in 1972, I came back, and it was a very, very difficult time to come back, but it wasn't that I chose it because it was difficult. I chose it because that's when I could get away. That's when I could come, in terms of my work and so on. I had a job with the National Film Board, which I left in order to come to Europe, and in my resignation letter I wrote sometimes, we choose work and sometimes we choose life, and right now I'm choosing life. So yes, I had quite a tangle with the police, which I describe in the book, because I wanted a residence permit, and there were certain demands they made of me if I were to get the residence permit that I was not willing to comply with. And it took meeting after meeting after meeting with them. The little card coming in the mail, please show up at the police station at such and such a time. And eventually...
What you're actually saying here, sort of euphemistically, is they were asking you to spy.
Yes. Yes.
Which, there's a wonderfully vivid bit in the book where you actually, not being from Czechoslovakia, being originally from Czechoslovakia, but coming from Canada, you confront them openly with what they're trying to get you to do, don't you?
Absolutely. I said, you mean you want me to spy? They called it getting together with them regularly to make sure I was doing okay and to know who I had met and to make sure I didn't get involved with the wrong element. So yes, I said, you want me to spy? And they said, oh, they were affronted. So I resolved it finally by, well, should I say how I resolved it? Or is that one of those things to leave in the book?
Do it make people buy the book? I don't know.
Okay.
Anyway, I mean, you didn't bend. You didn't.
I didn't.
You stood up to them, and they gave you a residence permit, nonetheless.
Yes.
I think that's not spoiling too much because we'll know from the next bit that you managed to stay.
Yes.
And you did manage to stay. And these are I think my favourite parts of the book are when you're describing your life in these bohemian circles, all focusing on the Malá Strana, the lesser quarter of Prague, which has changed so much since then. Tell us a little bit about your friends and also where you lived, and then we're going to hear a little extract, which I think we can probably hear the whole extract.
Okay.
Which sort of gives us a taste of the kind of life that you were living.
Well, I consider myself incredibly fortunate that I met and became involved in two groups of dissidents. Artists who weren't allowed to show and writers who weren't allowed to publish. And two groups, Spolek Pohodlí and Zlatá Praha. And through an artist who belonged to both and with whom I ended up having a relationship. So I had the very fortunate experience to basically be part of those two groups to some extent and to know how life was lived by those groups. And basically what they did was they created akce, happenings, to try and relieve some of the oppressiveness of daily life and maintain some happiness, some joy, some connection. So, yes.
Let's hear a description of one of the happenings. We've got plenty of time, and it's so vividly written. I think we should hear that we were reflecting on whether to tell this whole story or not. But I think that this is a wonderful scene of a roller skate race on the Charles Bridge. I mean, if you were to try and do it today, it would have to be in the middle of the night, and followed by a completely anarchic scene, as you'll hear in a minute. And it's also the beginning of your wonderful romantic love affair with Karel.
At 1:45 the following Sunday, I hurried down Nosticová, across the low bridge over the Čertovka, and onto Kampa Island. As I climbed the wide steps up to Charles Bridge, I saw a knot of young people milling around at the foot of the bridge. Passers-by were detouring around them with resentful glances and hurrying on. I approached with trepidation. Milan and Yana waved. Peppa shook my hand. He had on a First World War leather pilot's helmet and leather shorts. I looked around for Carl. "He's coming," Anna assured me. A much older man with a trim white beard, he must have been 70, wearing shorts and a tank top that emphasized his skinny white arms and shoulders, was stretching, touching his toes and performing a rapid series of jumping jacks. He wore a racer's sign on his chest which read, "Pozor, zaczyna zawód." Attention, the race is starting. Carl hurried towards us, a pair of roller skates swinging from one hand. He threw me a wide grin and a wave, sat down on a curb, and affixed the skates to his shoes. Suddenly, he was even taller as he staggered over to me. He gave me a quick hug. "Ready, Yarda?" he asked the older man in the shorts and tank top, who gave a grave, official nod. Yarda bent over into a runner's starting position. Carl took a starter's pistol from his pocket, aimed it into the air, and fired. Yarda took off like a shot and scampered across the bridge, dodging people and shouting, "Pozor, pozor," in his most officious voice. People turned, stepped aside, made way. At the far end of the bridge, Yarda turned and continued clearing the way on his return trek. Curious passers-by stopped and lined the bridge, waiting. The group assembled, 10 men, 4 women, all in various get-ups, afro wigs, Austrian lederhosen. Carl handed Yarda the pistol. The racers crouched into their starting position. The gun roared, and the racers lurched forward, hobbling over the rough cobblestones. A crowd had gathered, laughing now, infected by the racers' laughter. Cheers went up, urging the racers on. Some tripped, fell, got up, and kept going. I stood at the sidelines, clapping, delighted at this spectacle. Such a contrast to the oppression of daily life. As I watched Carl and his friends, I felt a powerful yearning to be a part of this life. Maybe this was what I'd been searching for. The racers straggled back, rosy with exertion, joyful. The crowd that had gathered clapped, called out their thanks, and gradually dispersed. What else was there to do but regroup back at Ubonaparta? Carl, exuberant, put his arm around my shoulders, and we traipsed through Malastrana, up the steep street. We spilled into the pub and crowded into the group's usual table. I sat there, a part of the merriment, drinking, laughing along with them, Carl sitting next to me. I was falling in love, and it frightened me. I knew so little about him. How could he be so gorgeous and yet unattached? Surely women in his circle wanted him. Might one of them sitting here be angry or heartbroken, watching us together? What troubled me even more was wondering if I could ever understand Carl or these amazing friends of his. How could I connect in any real way with their experience and be part of this world? It was closing time and no one wanted to go home. "Gespiewachku," someone yelled. Everyone downed their beer, paid up, and we tumbled out the door and down the hill. "Will you come?" Carl asked. Uspiewachku is another one of our favorite bars that stays open late. Of course I would. We piled into the 22 tram on the square, oblivious to other passengers' disapproving stares, and leapt out at Narodni Divadlo. We made our way through the streets behind the National Theatre and through a set of velvet curtains into a dark, narrow little bar. No one sat down. We milled around the bar, a dozen conversations going on at once. Shots were ordered, shots of vodka, brandy, Myslivetska, Slivovica. Even when Uspiewachku's closing time drew near, nobody was ready to call it quits. "Let's go back to my place," shouted Tomasz, one of our crowd. "You got anything to drink?" another yelled. "We'll buy wine here." We trooped through the streets. The trams had stopped running long ago and squeezed into Tomasz's flat. "How about if I make some soup?" Tomasz's offer was greeted with cheers. Music was put on, the wine opened, and the party roared on. Sometime later, an acrid burning smell wafted through the flat. "The soup!" someone yelled. Tomasz dashed into the kitchen and groaned. "I don't know about this," he said, handing out bowls of a dark porridge-like substance. It didn't smell good. I let mine cool, then dipped my spoon in it and took a tentative taste. It was inevitable. It was inedible. Carl was waiting to see my reaction. I'd had way too much to drink. I picked up a spoonful of the stuff and went to offer it to Carl, but suspicious, he turned away, and it smeared on his cheek. We both burst out laughing. I took another spoonful and threw it at him. Someone else watching us took a spoonful and flung that. Soon there was soup flying everywhere. The hall runner was rolled up. A couple of bowlfuls were dumped on the parquet floor, and in our socks we took turns running and sliding up and down the hall, which was slippery by then as a skating rink. Soup ran down the walls, the furniture, our clothes, our hair. It was close to morning when we staggered out of poor Tomasz's flat. The group dispersed. "I don't think we'll be invited back to his place again," I laughed, exhausted, exhilarated, drunk. "You started all that, you know," Carl marveled. "You're incredible." "I am," I said. "You're outrageous," he said. "I am. I think I love you," he said.
And that's the beginning of a wonderfully romantic love affair.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
And one thing that we talked about last week when we were discussing the book is the paradox of the fact that you came here from Canada at that awful time for Czechoslovakia, and in a strange way you found freedom.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it is. To me, it's very ironic thinking back on that, where I didn't, well, partly because of my mother's attitudes towards Canada, where she had railed. She had said things like, "What is this place? Where are there cafes? Where are there opera houses? What?" It was very raw and very difficult for her, and it was very conservative. And I felt like an alien there. I felt like I was an imposter pretending to be Canadian. So that, along with this notion that that's where happiness lay, because that's where we had been happy, took me there, and I was looking for my freedom and to where I belonged and felt at home. And so in this very ironic way, I came in 1972 looking for freedom to the most oppressed place practically I could have chosen. And yet, an incident like that shows what I meant. That's what I was looking for. I was looking for passion and involvement and a purpose other than getting good grades, getting a good job, and making money. And I found that purpose just being in that kind of group who were fighting. Basically, they were fighting for democracy. That's what dissidents were, I think, is that they were looking for a way to deal with the oppression, a way out of the oppression. So,
and there's also a hint in that extract of how you were perceived by them. That the fact that you were there with somebody who'd come voluntarily from Canada to be in the midst of this was important for your friends as well, I think, in Prague.
Well, there was actually an expression that Carl taught me that was "To je Kanada." that's Canada. And that was their expression for it's perfect, it's wonderful. So somebody would get a commission to do something, and the expression was Doya Canada. So they had this very also idealistic and romantic and idea about Canada, which was true, of course, in many ways. That I did bring freedom with me. I did bring this attitude of not being intimidated. Having been fortunate enough to grow up in Canada, I was a child of freedom in many senses, but looking for something more, which I think for people that I met with was ironic, because they always assumed that people who lived in Canada or in the West had freedom of all kinds, or meaning, or whatever it was I was looking for.
And you were both. You were both a Canadian and a Czech. That's how you're always introduced, aren't you? When Karel and other people are introducing you to other people in their circle.
Yes.
Ona jest Kanady, ale je Czeszka. She's
Yes.
She's from Canada, but she's Czech.
Yes. Yes. So in a way, to write this book, somehow it was important to me to be doing both, because I was a Czech, but with a Canadian perspective, so I could look at it differently. And yet I was very proud of my Czech heritage and my Czechness, and yet it was kind of added to by having grown up with freedom and having that perspective when I came here.
But you were also an outsider to some extent, and you talk about that feeling of not quite being inside this circle of friends, and we're going to hear another extract where you talk about this.
Yeah, and of course, the other piece of that is the language. I didn't speak Czech well. I understood it because of listening to my parents speak it, but I didn't speak it. So when that happens, you don't really know whether what you're saying is getting people to understand you the way you really are. I felt sometimes I was speaking a much more basic, kind of babyish, domestic Czech. And how could these friends of mine know who I was when I couldn't say what I meant to say in the language I was most comfortable in? But yes. This is, well, you've introduced it already, so I'll just go and read. One evening, as Karl and I sat in the pub, he was telling me about some of his students and their work. He mentioned one in particular named Eva and went on to say, "She's a pretty good artist for a girl." His words hit a nerve. "What did you say?" I asked. He stared at me, not understanding my tone, and repeated it. Why shouldn't she be as good an artist as any guy?" I challenged him. The sexism of his statement shocked me. I railed at him. He listened wide-eyed, utterly unaware of having said anything objectionable, but nodded and was thoughtful as I spoke. He ended up agreeing with me, realizing it was an unthinking and unjust bias. He actually did have quite a number of gifted female students. Karl was not alone in his sexist assumptions. They were woven into the fabric of Czech society. Czechoslovakia in the 1970s was a sexist, male-dominated society. In North America, the women's movement was gaining steam. I'd been away and hadn't had a chance to participate in what was going on, but I'd heard of the work of Betty Friedan and Germaine Greer and was excited at what was happening. My beliefs were strongly feminist. All my life I'd been hurt and angered by anything that degraded women or denied women opportunities. I'd been wounded deeply by my mother, who clearly preferred my brothers and curtailed my freedom in a way she didn't with her sons. They were free to be outside playing baseball after dinner, while I was to stay back to clean up and wash the dishes. At school, my brothers took shop, building things, learning carpentry and other interesting skills. I had to take home economics, sewing aprons and baking muffins. Preparing me, I fumed, for that life of servitude that seemed to be a woman's lot. Not for me, I vowed. Should I read out that
There
part?
was the other bit.
Yeah,
Maybe
okay.
leave it out, but
Okay.
maybe leave that bit out.
Yes,
and read
yes.
the last bit.
In Czechoslovakia, the women's movement, if it was mentioned at all, was ridiculed or dismissed with contempt as either a joke or an outrage. News was censored, so very little of what the issues were and what was happening outside the country penetrated. People couldn't know that the nonsense being fed to them through local media about the meaning of the women's movement was just that, nonsense. Feminism was portrayed as yet another example of decadent capitalism and not to be taken seriously. In Czech society, the work women did was devalued. It was a politic run by men, with men holding all the higher status jobs in the Communist Party and in society at large. Men were head waiters and waiters in the better establishments. Women were waitresses in the lowlier places. No matter where women worked, they earned a fraction of what men earned. Ironically, when women entered a profession, that profession was devalued. When women became the majority of doctors, the medical profession lost status. A waiter at the Ambassador Hotel on Wenceslas Square earned more and had a higher status than a doctor or a dentist, the waiter having access to hard currency. Socially, men gathered with one another in pubs while women were relegated to the home, expected to come home after work and care for the children, do all the housework, and cook dinner for hubby when he decided to come home from drinking with his buddies. Even the Spolek Pohodli and Zlata Praha, the groups I was so proud to sit with, were men's groups, welcoming women only as partners of their members.
And this was a thing that troubled you, but ultimately it wasn't the reason that you left Czechoslovakia. There was a rather more dramatic set of events that led to your departure. And, well, it began with Karel joining the Communist Party.
Yes. Yes. He was a professor at the Academy of Fine Arts and a dissident. So I went away. I left town for a few weeks to visit my parents who had come to Austria. And when I came back, I was sitting with a member of our group named Honza, who was a sculptor. And he had asked me if I would kindly sit for him. He had been commissioned with a sculpture, a bust, by the Cuban embassy, and would I sit with him? And I thought, well, that sounds like fun. I'll do it. So, this next segment is from a conversation that Honza and I had while I was sitting for him in his studio. "You're lying," I said. "I don't believe you." He stopped smiling. "I'm sorry to be the one to tell you." "How could he do that?" I cried. Honza was silent. He'd stopped working and stood there, his hands by his sides. I cast around, looking at him, at the room surrounding us, at the red clay roofs outside his window, as though looking for clues to this new reality, working hard to grasp what I'd heard. Eventually it hit me that he was telling the truth. Despite everything Carl had said and done, everything he'd told me he stood for, he had caved. And then I began to rail. A flood of passionate invective burst from deep within me. How the hell can anything change in this goddamn country when even the most passionate opponents of this fucking evil regime end up signing on the dotted line? On and on I went, venting my shock, my disbelief, my profound disappointment. A diatribe against the system and against Carl, who I never imagined would give in. Hunza was silent the whole time. Finally, exhausted, I ran out of words. He stood unmoving. "Let's quit for today," he said quietly. He took a cloth, wet it at the sink, and covered his work. "Let's go to Ubonaparta. They'll be there by now." I pulled off my hat, grabbed my jacket, and headed for the door. Carl was sitting there, sitting among the group. I couldn't pretend. He noticed it at once. "What is it?" he whispered, taking a seat beside me. I shook my head and took a big slug of the beer that appeared in front of me. Many slugs of beer. I couldn't look at him. "Let's get out of here. Let's talk." I shook my head. I sat there in the group trying to calm myself, but none. I couldn't make sense of it. Carl looked as dear and as beautiful as ever, but Hans's news had transformed him in my eyes. I didn't know him. He was a liar. He was a traitor. He was what people derisively called a carrierista, a careerist, a person who would betray his principles and his friends in order to get ahead. I couldn't talk to him. I sat silent within the group and drank. Finally, when the pub was closing, the group disbanded and Carl and I were out on the sidewalk. "You have to tell me what the matter is," Carl said. "I knew the moment you walked into the pub. Tell me." I was afraid to say it. That would make it real. Finally, I blurted it out. "Hunza told me you joined the party." He stared at me, silent now. "Is it true?" "I was afraid that was it," he said, his head bent low. "Is it true?" I asked again. He nodded. "It is." We stood in the silence and the dark. "It's against everything I thought you stood for, everything you believed," I said. "Helenko, let me explain. Please try to understand." There's a little section I'll leave out. And then, in the end, though it took me many days, I was able to reconcile myself to what had happened. I realized I'd been harsh and uncompromising and forgave him. Who was I to sit in judgment? In Canada, I'd grown up with a strong sense of entitlement and of individual freedom that Carl had never experienced. I'd never had to confront the kind of impossible situation he'd been faced with. Over and over, he took pains to explain himself. So, clearly what I could add is that he was told that to remain a professor he had to become a communist, and he felt that if he was going to tell his students the truth, or if he were to remain an instructor there, he'd have more influence on young people than if he left the academy. So.
And there's another twist in this story, isn't it? In that Honza, the friend who told you that Karel had joined the party, was in fact, it turned out that he himself was a secret police informer. And on the basis of what you had said to him about how you felt bitter about what Karel had done, that got back to the authorities, and that ultimately led to you having to leave the country.
Yes.
You could maybe tell us a little bit more.
Yes. What do I read next? Yes, well, it turned out, I found out many, many years later that Honza had in fact been an informer and was paid 2,000 crowns for everything that he told, every piece of information that he gave to the police, and the Spolek Pohodli threw him out. They found out that was the case. But yes, indeed, after I'd been there, should I tell the whole story about what happened?
Well, it's maybe not the whole story, but I mean it's important in a sense in that you and Karel, your relationship survived this crisis, but it didn't survive the politics.
That's right. That's right. He received a note to show up at the police station, and he went and was horrified to discover that they had all these charges against me. And then I was called in and not even told what the charges were, but charged with anti-state activities and given till midnight to get out of the country. And so that was the end of that relationship, that wonderful, passionate, happy relationship. He couldn't get out, I couldn't get back in, and so that ended abruptly, and it wasn't for many years till I could get back in, and by then I had been back in Canada. I was shattered at first, but rebuilt, started a wonderful organization as part of the women's movement that I founded, and met my husband, the other great love in my life, and so we had a son, and the three of us traveled back to Europe, did a tour of Europe, and went to Prague. And the story is, I won't tell you the story because it's charming and wonderful, about how I reconnected with Prague despite his parents, with Karel despite his parents.
You haven't actually explained his parents, because they played a dreadful role in the whole story. I mean, this is where it gets, truth is stranger than fiction, or truth is more dramatic than fiction, that Karel wrote to you every day in Canada from Prague after you were thrown out. You wrote to him, but he never got the letters.
That's right.
And it wasn't because the secret police were disposing of them.
Yes. So yes, when we parted that last, I talked the police into giving me till noon as opposed to midnight. So yes, we had that last night where we talked and talked and talked about everything that we needed to say, and one of them was that he would be waiting for me, and would write me every day. So there was a postcard that came every single day, ending in Chekam, and I wrote back, I'm waiting. I wrote back, but heard nothing until I got a letter from his father. And I saw the letter, and it said Zavadil, and I thought, oh, at last I've got a letter from Karel. It was from his father announcing that he was married and that I should conduct myself accordingly. So that trip that we took, my husband, my son, and myself, and went to Prague, we finally got together and discovered, to our horror, Karel's and mine, especially his, that it was his father who had made sure he didn't get my letters, any of them. So he thought I had just simply disappeared back to Canada, no longer interested, and that was the end of our relationship, and he started another eventually and married. So yes, he was betrayed by his father as well as the system.
And in the meantime, in the 70s and 80s, you built a second life, a parallel life in a sense in Canada, and you were as you mentioned in passing, you were extremely active. You were, maybe if you could just say in a few words about the Pauline McGibbon Cultural Centre that you founded in Toronto, which is a sign of your, what's the word, indefatigability, how do you pronounce that word? Untiring energy. And it was also, I think, in a way connected with what you'd been through in Czechoslovakia, wasn't it?
Well, I had lost so much, being thrown out, and was shattered. But what was there for me in Canada was the women's movement that I'd been missing here. And I also made the connection. I thought, dissidents in the Czech Republic are very similar, I hope this isn't offensive, to women in a patriarchal society. And we need to support one another, to create, to do the work we want to do within our community, and not be held back by perhaps not having access to galleries and publishers. So I said, what we need in Canada is a cultural center for the work of women artists. And that's what I founded, called the Pauline McGibbon Cultural Center. First it was called the Women's Cultural Center, and then we changed the name to the Pauline McGibbon Cultural Center. Pauline McGibbon was a prominent woman in Toronto, in Ontario, who was Lieutenant Governor, and she kindly let me use her name. So it was this wonderful building with a theater and an art gallery and a concert hall and workshop space and a library. And we conducted workshops and had concerts and plays. So that's what I did when I got back. But I was still very interested in what was going on here. And where do we go from here?
We go from here, I think, to the Velvet Revolution. And you, obviously for you, it was a moment of great euphoria. You came back to Czechoslovakia after the Velvet Revolution. But one of the most moving episodes in the whole book is, because this book is always full of surprises. That's one of the things, because your experience is unique, so nothing follows stereotype. Where you meet Karel again, it's a very, very sad episode.
Yes. It was very exciting meeting again, and it was as though time hadn't gone by at all. But what do I need to say that would make it? So yes, he was kicked out of when the revolution happened. The irony was that he was kicked out because of the academy, because he was a communist. So we met, and I was waxing eloquent about how wonderful the revolution, everything is great, freedom has come. And Karel, I don't get it. You were a dissident, hung out with Havel, one of the leaders of the revolution. The communists were finally defeated. I thought that's what you stood for. What I stood for, he snarled, I was an artist and a teacher. Art was what I cared about. The revolution stole everything from me. I told you, it got me thrown out of the academy. They labeled me a communist and threw me out. All of us. As if we'd had any choice back then. Now you show up spouting this crap about how great it is. I guess it is for you. You can blow in and out now whenever you please, while I'm stuck in a boiler room shoveling shit for a living. I was overwhelmed. But Carl, you're free now, I stammered. You can do whatever you want. Paint, teach, whatever. He didn't answer. Are you painting? For Christ's sake, aren't you listening to me? I'm telling you, I'm broken. Everything has gone to rat shit. I don't do anything because nothing's worth doing. I've lost everything. I sweat it out in the boiler room, sit here with these drunken assholes all afternoon, go home to pass out, then drag myself back to the boiler room. Every day. That's my life now, thanks to the revolution.
Karel did, to a certain extent, manage to put his life, or to rebuild his life, didn't he? And he started painting again and teaching.
He did, but it didn't last. And I thought it would, because every time I came to Prague, either with my husband or by myself, we'd get together and there was this, sometimes he'd be fine, sometimes not. And sometimes there'd be these late night phone calls. Where are you? Why aren't you here? But in the end, he drank himself to death.
Effectively, yes.
Drank himself to death and died in the street falling. And having a concussion and dying a week later in the hospital.
Just before his 60th birthday.
Just before his 60th birthday. And there was as a member of Zlata Praha, there was a tradition that when the members turned 60, they were declared presidents. And he just missed that by a few months.
Let's not end on such a gloomy note. There's a very upbeat ending to this story, which again is connected with Karel, and well, maybe you can tell the story and read the little extract from very close to the end of the book.
Yes, this was my finding resolution. The next day, I had a copy of the photo of Carl made with a white border below it. There I wrote in Czech, Carl, thank you for everything you gave me, your love, your art, your world. Thank you for bringing me home to my world. Know that you were deeply loved. Helena. I slid it into a silver frame. Back at Uzavěšeného Cafe that evening, I was introduced to the owner who sat at the bar, a woman around my age, drinking, smoking, laughing, chatting with friends. I introduced myself and made my request. Who was your friend? My request was to hang the photo in the cafe where photos of the other members of Zlata Praha were hung. Who was your friend? She asked. I told her. Of course, she said, we knew him. Her friend said. One of them, a man with long hair and a beard, turned out to be the artist whose murals covered the cafe walls. I produced the photo. Of course we'll hang it, the owner said. Outside, walking down Nerudova, I stopped and took a deep breath, looked up at the deep, star-filled sky, heard the symphony of laughter and conversations of passers-by, and noticed the glorious evening all around me. I wanted to laugh, to run, to skip, suddenly light, weightless, free.
I think we can end on that note. Just maybe one little coda, which I think is wonderful, is that you came back, you have a flat now in Prague, you moved between Toronto and Prague, you were given Czech citizenship.
Yes.
You and Walter's son, Adam, also has Czech citizenship.
Yes. Yes.
And I think that the home that you talk about, the long journey home, is it's Canada, it's here, it's somewhere within you, isn't it?
Yes, yes. And it's in both places, and just a reconciliation to my journey, to my quest.
And thank you enormously for reading lots of extracts. I wanted us to have a lot because it's such a good book, and it's so much is unexpected and very powerful. And thank you as well for exposing yourself in that way, because I know it's not easy. Let's open the discussion to the floor if anybody has any comments or questions. There are so many things, so many aspects, that you must have lots of bits and pieces where you're thinking, I wonder what happened next, or I wonder what became of that person or that person. So if you're happy to answer questions, let's turn to the floor. We've got a microphone there as well.
Thank you, Helen. So glad that you finished your book.
Pardon?
I'm so glad you finished your book.
Ah, thank you.
This is just personal, but I used to meet her in Malastrana and invite her to events, and she said, I'm sorry, I'm writing my book. I can't come. And I was quite upset sometimes. I thought, God, why can't you just come to my reading or this or that? But now I'm happy you've done it. So thank you for that. I just encountered a line in a book that I was reading by Walker Percy, and the line really kind of resonated strongly in me. You know, he said that love is infinite happiness. Losing it is infinite unhappiness. And so obviously you had love, you had this infinite happiness. How did you cross over to find new love and new infinite happiness?
I think it's possible to have two loves. And you could say I was torn between them, but no, I simply loved two people. But I was also faithful and didn't want to hurt the new one.
Which must have also been a matter of great trust for your husband.
Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. And that's actually that's a part of the story as well. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
What did your mother think of your coming back to Czechoslovakia?
My mother longed to come back and would have and wanted to come back herself. It was my father who was angry and worried and frightened for me and kept saying, don't you know that it's dangerous? And I was young, I didn't care, or I didn't believe it to that extent. And after I came, that very first time and the second time, she wanted to go back too and said to my father, see, Helen was okay being there and I want to go too. But his attitude was, I will never set foot in that country again. And had this idea that the bastard stole it from him. That was his expression, and he would never set foot in it again. But my mother came back. She too was shocked and horrified by what had been done to the country during the communist era. But she was thrilled to be reunited with her family. I asked asked her in the book at one of the conversations we had, do you wish we had stayed? Or what do you think it would have been like if you had stayed? And she said it would have been a nightmare. So
it was kind of on one hand, she missed it and had this longing, but she knew, I mean, that must have been such obviously it was a stress for her of how to reconcile everything that she tried to reconcile. Anyway, thank you for your readings. It's really been an amazing experience.
You're very welcome. Thank you for the opportunity.
Excuse me, here is Charles' son.
Oh my goodness, come up, come up, come up. Oh my goodness.
Hello.
Oh my goodness.
Thank you for your story. It's very interesting for us, for our family. And sorry, my English is not very good because this story describes a strong difference in Czech society, in dissident, underground, and conformist. Yes, it is. And my father was destroyed by the system, and after the Velvet Revolution. And maybe we talk after this discuss. We talk about it.
Yes. Oh, sorry. That goes to someone.
And maybe, I mean, another thing is your mother comes across as a wonderful person.
We have a difficult situation because I grew up in communist system, and my family was divided two parts a little bit. My father, conformist in academy, in artist, and I don't know about your story about her. I don't know any information. And my mother was little bit dissident. Little bit, and she was a very problematic situation before Velvet Revolution, and it is a long story about. It is difficult. It is difficult. Thank you.
That comes across so strongly in the book that nothing is simple. Nothing is simple.
Thank you very much for coming. I did invite Carl's two sons, and thank you so much for coming. I'm thrilled to see you. There is a chapter or a section in the book about getting together once Carl had died, getting together with his widow and his sons, and my husband and son, and having lunch together. This was my idea. Let's put us all together, and it felt wonderful. It felt like creating new family, and I'm very delighted that you came this evening. Thank you. Bridges to be mended.
Simon, did you have a question?
Yes, just echoing your point on different sorts of freedom. Like you, I was here in '72, and the shock to me was that you could go in any wood, canoe down any river. I live in a part of England where there are huge signs. Trespassers would be prosecuted, gamekeepers with guns, traps on the ground. You know, it's not our country. This was Madras. You know, here you could go anywhere. You didn't have political freedom. You had other freedoms.
Yes. Yes, you mean in the no trespassing was where?
In England. In England you can't go anywhere.
Yes.
Everything's private.
Yes.
You know, here you can go mushrooms.
Very true. There were many ways, and just the way people dressed and looked and behaved was freer, because yes, Canada and was very conformist. You had to look a certain way, and of course we suffered from that as children when we arrived. My mother her neighbor scolded her for letting us as little children play naked in the backyard. We don't do that sort of thing here. So yes, There are many different kinds of freedom.
Shall we carry... No, sorry. Just a second. Can you take the microphone?
I'm just wondering, was there a foreign community here at all in the early 70s? Did you meet other Americans or expats here?
Yes, a few. Paul Wilson was a friend of mine, and he was part of the Plastic People of the Universe, and he's a Canadian who was living here. He had come a few years before I had, and he worked as a translator. He translated many of Havel's books in Canada.
There's a rather delightful scene in the book where you mention to Carol and his friends that you know Paul Wilson and the Plastic People, and he says, "Oh, they're boring. You don't want to have anything to do with them. We're much more interesting."
Yeah, the rivalry among the dissident groups. Yes, yes.
Shall we carry on informally? There's, I think, plenty of wine left at the back, and I'm sure that lots of you would like to have the opportunity to talk personally as well to Helen. Helen, thank you enormously for that. It's very moving. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you all. Now let me just add a couple of things. I do have books available for purchase if you'd like to buy one, and otherwise it's available at the Globe Bookstore and Cafe, where I'm doing a reading next Monday evening, if any of you have friends who would like to pass that on to. And it's also available at the Oxford Bookstore in Vinohrady. And if you read my book, please be so kind as to send me your comments, because I'm always interested in hearing people's reaction and their thoughts about the book. And then one more thing. I've had many readers say to me, "This should be a movie." And so that's my next dream. I've accomplished some of them by the very fact that I'm here at this gorgeous location sharing my book. But that's my next dream, and I would love it to be, say, a Czech-Canadian co-production. And so if you have any suggestions or any connections that would help me turn that dream into a reality, please let me know. I've left my card here, and I'd be happy to receive emails, helen.notzel@gmail.com, very simple, or on my website, helennotzel.com. And again, thank you all for coming. It's been an absolute joy. Thank you. And one more thank you. Thank you, David. Thank you, David Vaughn, for being such a fabulous moderator and turning this into a conversation and a discussion. Thank you, David. Thank you.